Thank you so much all for joining us today for the global launch of our ideas paper on queering atrocity prevention. My name is Kate Ferguson. I am co-executive director at Protection Approaches, and it is my enormous pleasure to be chairing today's conversation. We are here to talk about some really important issues that we and our team have been thinking about over the last year or so. From the Holocaust to the anti-gay purges in Chechnya, LGBTQI people have been deliberately targeted by widespread, systematic campaigns of violence that can be described as atrocity crimes. And yet, these unique risks and vulnerabilities that LGBTQI communities face too often remain missing from the work of atrocity prevention and the wider approaches to reducing conflict and instability. And this leaves LGBTQI plus communities excluded and at risk. And the paper that we launched today and the wider work that Protection Approaches is doing on queering atrocity prevention is really trying to look at some of these gaps and these intersections. We are exploring how our own communities of practice, of which we are part of, we're looking at our own gaps, not other people's, how we might better address these blind spots. And we're looking at what queering our work could really look like. The support from friends and colleagues, honestly, around the world that we have received as we've begun to raise these questions kind of internally within the sector has just been incredible. And I constantly feel so extremely lucky to work in a sector that is open to new ideas and is so generous in collaboration. The opening up of how we see our responsibility to help protect people from identity-based violence and from atrocity crimes, whether we use the definition of the United Nations principle or our own concepts of responsibility and solidarity. It requires us to constantly be thinking about who is included and who is being excluded. And that is a tension that runs through the entire history of rights. And at Protection Approaches, we work to transform how identity-based violence is understood, because we think that in doing so, we can transform how it is prevented. And so we really hope that this paper that we present to you all today makes a contribution to this endeavour and will stimulate really practical conversations within the atrocity prevention fields of research, policy and practice. That today's launch and publication day coincides with the International Transgender Day of Visibility is serendipitous. We didn't plan it, but it feels so entirely appropriate. The rise in toxic and hostile behaviour towards trans people and trans rights in the UK, which is where Protection Approaches is based, was part of why we took this paper on and this work on, because we do believe at starting at home. And so for many reasons, we are, it feels auspicious that our publication day fell today. Before I turn to our extraordinary panel of fabulous speakers, I must take some time for some thank yous. First of all, this work was supported by funds from the UK government, and we are very grateful for the support and real genuine enthusiasm that we have received from them towards this important work. And I really hope that that is something that will continue. We're really grateful for that. Secondly, throughout this project, we have sought consultation from our partners at Stonewall, and their generosity and their knowledge and their advice and their good humour throughout this entire period has been so incredibly well appreciated, and we are extremely proud to have them as our partner. Finally, this paper really was a joint effort It was co-authored by Jess, who is going to be representing all of us today. But it was co-authored by Dean Cooper Cunningham, by myself, by Detmer Kramer, by Farida Mustafa, and it was truly shared. And I am so very, very grateful for all of their work. And 5 authors on a paper, that sounds tough, but it actually wasn't. It was a joy, and hopefully that it was 4 voices is seen in a strong way rather than a disparate one when you read it. But now let me turn to this extraordinary panel that we have here today. First of all, it's my honor to introduce Jess. Jess Gifkins is Protection Approaches Queering Atrocity Prevention Research Fellow, and aren't we lucky to have her? She's also a lecturer in international relations at the University of Manchester, but it is important that I would really like to draw attention. She is speaking today in her capacity for Protection Approaches. And this is because today is a strike day for staff at the University of Manchester due to a dispute over pay, the casualisation of work, overwork, equality for women, Black and minoritized staff, disabled staff. And we stand in solidarity with the very important higher education academic institutions in the UK that are having a tough time. But Jess is representing us at Protection Approaches today. She is an expert in global governance, particularly in the relations of peace and security. She has published research on all sorts of things relating to the fields of atrocity prevention and R2P. I couldn't possibly list them all, but she has written about Darfur, about Libya, about Syria, about how the UN Security Council works, or perhaps does not always work. And Jess should really be credited with conceiving the idea of R2P. She came to Protection Approaches in 2020 to explore, you know, if this was something that Protection Approaches was interested in, to kind of share some concerns around these gaps and whether we could work together. And it has just been an immense privilege to be able to respond to Jess's questions and take this forward. And I love my job, and sometimes it's tough, but being able to go, yeah, let's run with it, let's do it. And so thank you, Jess, for coming to us. And today's the day where we present some of that thinking to the world. We're then going to go for some responses, and we're going to get some feedback on our paper and talk about the wider issues. And we are absolutely delighted that Victor Madrigal-Boloz, independent expert for the United Nations on sexual orientation and gender identity, is going to be responding today. We're really thrilled to have you. And Victor, your biography is so extensive that even when I try to cut it down, I feel like, you know, I'd be running for about 5 extra minutes. I can't possibly do it justice, but he's currently senior visiting researcher at Harvard Law School on the Human Rights Program. Until 2019, he served as the Secretary General of the International Rehabilitation Council for Torture Victims, a global network of 150 rehabilitation centres, looking to sort of the rehabilitation of all victims of torture and ill treatment. As a member of the UN Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture from 2013 to 2016, he was rapporteur on reprisals and oversaw draft policy on torture and ill treatment on LGBTI persons. I could go on and on. And likewise with our second respondent to the paper, Savita Pande, Executive Director of the Global Centre for the Responsibility to Protect. Savita, a tour de force in the atrocity prevention sector, and I likewise just cannot do justice to your extensive contributions to our sector and to your leadership. Savita has led the Global Centre's work on peacekeeping, on international justice mechanisms, on women, peace and security, on advocacy on many, many specific country situations where populations are at risk of atrocities, whether that is Syria, whether that is Myanmar, South Sudan, Yemen, Ethiopia. She has written extensively about R2P and atrocity prevention. So you can agree, who better could we have to be responding to our paper on queering atrocity prevention? You have heard far, far too much from me now, and I will very shortly turn over to our speakers. We're going to hear from Jess, who's going to present. Victor and Savita will respond, and then they're going to engage in some discussion. I will jump in if people are running long for timekeeping. Forgive me in advance. And so that means that we're not really able to engage in the full discussion with all of you today, but we really, really do look forward to doing so. This paper is now live. It will be shared in the chat. It is available on Twitter, on our website. Please do let us know what you think of it. On behalf of all of the authors, you know, this is an ideas paper. We welcome engagement and feedback and discussion. Of course, please live tweet throughout the event using the hashtags Queering Atrocity Prevention or Queering R2P. We want this to be a conversation, so please sort of help get that conversation going. Now, that is enough from me. Jess, the virtual floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Kate, and that was such a kind and generous welcome to all of us, and I'm so delighted to be with you, Savita and Victor, as well on the panel. So we began this project wanting to think about how LGBTQI plus people were always already part of the community that atrocity prevention actors serve. So part of the goal of this project is to make what is often an implicit inclusion of queer people explicit, and we want to call on others to do that as well. And by doing this, we hope to highlight some of the specific persecution that LGBTQI plus people face, as well as our resistance. And I wanted to start by giving a brief personal narrative of how this project came about and why it's so important to me and to all of us, really. So for myself, by 2020, I'd worked in the atrocity prevention field for well over a decade. Mostly researching decision-making in the United Nations, especially the Security Council. And I hadn't given sufficient consideration to the relationship between queer people and atrocity prevention. For me personally, it was my partner's gender transition, which occurred alongside the rapid rise of transphobia in the UK and elsewhere. And that really prompted a sense of urgency for me and for all of us in considering what it might look like to queer atrocity prevention. For me, it was also a quite welcome return to my undergraduate degree in gender and sexuality studies. And so that's been a fun component as well. Another impetus for this project is building on Jamie Hagan's work on queering the women, peace and security agenda. And that prompted a curiosity in us really to think about what it might look like to queer R2P. So I'm sharing this story to say to other actors in atrocity prevention, there's never too late to be more inclusive and explicit in building an approach that serves all members of the communities that we advocate for. And yeah, also because it's International Transgender Day of Visibility, as Kate noted, I think that's important and I can't think of how you pronounce that word, but it's a very welcome alignment that day is the same as our launch. So from the beginning, when I approached Kate, Protection Approaches and Dean, all were enthusiastic and welcoming about developing a program of work on queering atrocity prevention. And so we're very delighted to launch the first of our papers into the world today, the first of a series. So we also are developing an academic paper, and there'll be future policy papers to look out for as well. So the beginning position really for this project is that we know that LGBTQI plus people have been targeted during and in the lead up to atrocity crimes, with the Holocaust as a really key historical example of this. More recently, we've seen persecution and violence against queer people in Afghanistan, Hungary, Chechnya, Egypt and Sudan, just to name a few examples. And we do talk about some of those examples in the paper. So as Kate highlighted, here in the UK, hate crimes against LGBTQ plus people are rising year on year, and there's a small but very vocal transphobic minority in the UK. So what we're seeing here is there's a real tension, I guess, between the rise of legal rights for queer people alongside a backlash against queer rights, and I think those two things are happening in parallel. So in the paper, we identify links between atrocity crimes and the persecution of sexual and gender minorities. We argue that the exclusion of LGBTQI plus people in existing atrocity prevention frameworks is a significant oversight, and we need to address that. And that's all of us need to work on that as a collective project and as an ongoing conversation. So we're not suggesting that all mass atrocities begin against a backdrop of violence and persecution of queer people, But we do argue that such violence against LGBTQI plus people tends to be a precursor to escalation and faster democratic backsliding, and that queer people face significant and unique insecurities in the context of conflict. So these vulnerabilities must be accounted for in our conflict and atrocity frameworks. Political homophobia and transphobia are used to serve political projects, and that's they're projects that might be domestic or international in orientation. And that's something that our co-author Dean has argued both in this paper and elsewhere in other projects. So framing queer people as the other for political purposes is something that we saw in Nazi Germany, where homosexuality was framed as a threat against masculinity, against the family, and against the nation. We also see it more recently in Russia, where Putin frames the West's queer friendliness as a threat to traditional family values, and he's used this to bolster a geopolitical campaign to save the West from itself because of its toleration of queer sexuality and gender. So all of this means that the silences in atrocity prevention and practice need to be addressed. And the silences, as they currently stand, are pervasive. So, for example, the premier journal, academic journal on atrocity prevention, the Global Responsibility to Protect, doesn't have any articles singularly focusing on LGBTQI plus persecution across its first 13 volumes. There are a couple of articles that do engage with this in part. And the largest compendium on atrocity prevention, which you can see on my shelf behind me, which is the Oxford University Press Handbook of the Responsibility to Protect. So it's over 1,000 pages, and it includes only one passing reference to queer identities. Now, I've been an author in that journal as well as in that handbook, so I'm including myself in these critiques. We've also found in our research that the 15 publicly available frameworks of atrocity risk indicators, none of these actually explicitly mention LGBTQI plus communities or vulnerabilities that they may face. We also found these silences evident in state practice. So states meet each year for annual dialogues on R2P in the General Assembly. And when we looked at the statements that they give, there's increasing reference to different types of identity groups and identity-based violence. And the groups that are referred to as are women and refugees, but there isn't equivalent recognition of the risks faced by queer people in those statements. So we're not singling out specific actors or authors within the atrocity prevention community in this critique. We've all missed out on opportunities to draw these connections in the past. But what we are asking is that we're all more mindful of LGBTQI plus persecution in our work going forward. A few bright spots to highlight. In the academic discipline of genocide studies, there has been a recent interest in exploring the intersection of queer identities and atrocity crimes, and some really great work coming out of that area. Also, the organisations such as the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide have long been working on these intersections in their training, research and programming. There's also a number of local organisations working on the front line of preventing atrocity crimes, who do undertake specific inclusive work that supports queer people at risk. So queering atrocity prevention is not only about seeing the violence affecting LGBTQI plus people, although that's certainly part of it, but it's also about advancing a queer political conviction to question the dehumanisation of some and the protection of others along what are arbitrary lines. So here we're arguing for recognition that anti-LGBT plus policies can be warning signs of much larger, often authoritarian and far right-wing political agendas. So there's kind of broader relationships here. We're also advocating a queer politics rooted in challenge to all systems of privilege. So it's not just about queer actors, although that's the focus of the report and of today. So to advocate this line of programming, we make a series of recommendations in the paper across the atrocity prevention community. So in particular, we're asking civil society organisations to encourage a sector-wide conversation about how we can ensure our tools and practices are fit for the purposes of contributing to the protection of LGBTQI plus people. We're asking actors to be explicit and proactive in including queer people as stakeholders. We're asking researchers to move beyond the implicit assumption that the communities they're researching and advocating for are cisgender or heterosexual, while also being mindful that these identity labels don't necessarily resonate in non-Western settings, and that there's a plurality of different types of identities and experiences that fall under this umbrella. We're asking that identity prevention actors include queer persecution into their existing frameworks of analysis, and that includes early warning frameworks. We're asking donors to consider providing quick release funding as well as long-term funding for LGBTQI plus organisations, especially where there's a risk of violence, an imminent risk of violence. So overall, we're asking that all of us explicitly acknowledge that LGBTQI plus people are part of the who that atrocity prevention serves. So I will leave it there and welcome your responses.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Jess. Victor, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kate, and thank you very much to Jess for her very comprehensive overview of this excellent report. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm happy because of a multitude of reasons, and one of them is that this is a field where the mandate is actually venturing right now, and where some of the links that are made in this report are going to prove extraordinary to the work of making violence and discrimination against LGBT and otherwise gender diverse persons visible, and to extract lessons from it that can build a theory, a working theory for atrocity prevention. As Kate mentioned in her introduction to Jess's presentation, the way in which we understand how violence is seen and understood is, of course, part of the whole work of prevention. And in this, I find a very interesting point of contact in the methodology that flows throughout the report with what is known as a traditional human rights-based approach, which places on reparations coming from fact-finding the idea of non-repetition as a fundamental element of prevention. That is to say that fact-finding leads to understanding patterns and lacks that are systemic, and leads to recommendations as to how to ensure that those gaps and those systemic factors can actually be changed so as to ensure non-repetition and thus prevention. And this is precisely what I think is the goal of a number of initiatives that include, of course, this very important one, is to ensure that by looking at a phenomenon such as atrocity through the prism of the lived experience of LGBT persons, there will be nuanced that will come out. And in a way, the diagnostic that is presented throughout this study, I think, immediately reveals language that is familiar to me, but from a different perspective. And this language relates to the way in which stigma is enabled by a series of institutional or social drivers, such as criminalization, demonization, or pathologization, and how these elements exacerbate the risk that some of these factors will be weaponized in the context of armed conflict or other humanitarian crises, and will lead, of course, to atrocities through the mechanism of othering, which is so clearly described in this report. The political return of investment that othering offers to certain fractions to galvanize political bases, for example, or to ensure galvanizing around some ideas of going against a particular population. I think the point of departure in the Nazi regime's persecution of homosexuals can only be complemented by examples that are also present in the report, such as the indicia that we have that in the former Yugoslavia, for example, this was a factor that was weaponized. the current realities of Boko Haram targeting, so in Nigeria, and of course the example that is presented in relation to the so-called gay purge in Chechnya, a situation in which I've created engagement with the Russian Federation on several occasions. Now, I think what this leads to is the very important recognition that structures, procedures, protocols, and practices that manage situations conducive to atrocities are not necessarily adequate to deal with the specificities of the particular exposure to risk of LGBT persons or persons that are impacted by stigma associated to sexual orientation and gender identity, because we know that that is the includes persons not identifying within the acronym. And I think the examples of Afghanistan, where, as we very well know, there were immediate indicia of poor risk management because of a lack of understanding of the dynamics of the communities in the context. That included the circulation of lists containing thousands of names through channels that did not actually have appropriate risk management structures behind them. Or, as we know, problems arising very clearly from day one in Ukraine, where we have the very clear example of trans women not being able to actually traverse borders or checkpoints because of lack of recognition of lack of legal recognition of gender identity. Now, I am realistic enough to understand that in situations like that, you cannot ask the state to put in place a training program for officers. And this just underscores the importance that those elements should have been in place on the first place as preparation for the possible occurrence of the situation. And this is where I actually think that this report presents significant ambition, which is the development of language and particular methodologies, understanding good practices, and of course, inspiration on the gender-based frameworks as an element that is highly conducive to addressing some of these issues, and where I expect that my report will actually be benefiting significantly from this work in the particular context of armed conflict. The point that the report makes from the title, which is queering spaces, is of course not more than signaling the importance of adding that element to the need for that prism that allows points of entry into this analysis. And this report makes that point very clearly with very specific examples and analytical narratives, and very, very appreciative of its existence and the very many questions that it raises for follow-up to the international community. So thank you very much, and very excited to follow up on this conversation in the future.
Thank you so much, Victor, for such warm words about the paper and yeah, that sort of wider analysis. And we also look forward to taking this conversation forward in different ways, and are eagerly awaiting your own report as and when you're ready. Savita, let's turn to you. We are very excited to hear what you will think of the work we've been doing. Floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kate. And I would like to begin by thanking Protection Approaches for inviting me to be part of this panel, and Jess, your fantastic summary of what the paper was all about. And Victor, I think that I have met you through different panels. We've been on a couple of panels together before, and it would be good that in the coming years we might actually see each other in person. But thank you again for having me and for this really important contribution to atrocity prevention. I think that I've been working in this field for a very long time, and the development of the field has been that there are more nuances added to how we prevent and how we respond to atrocities. And I think that this paper is a very important contribution to understanding nuances, to nuance atrocity prevention further than what has been going on with, in terms of how we're talking about women in this space, how we're talking about children in this space. And this paper, I think that, it largely focused on the fact that the LGBTQI experience has been essentially ignored by the atrocity prevention field. And approaches to sort of early warning and response within R2P and atrocity prevention are heteronormative, basically. And the paper also sort of, and this was a very important point, I think, not only in the context of LGBTQI, but also in the context of sort of the work that is being done by the WPS community, is that the paper sort of constantly emphasizes the fact that LGBTQI persecution, as well as imposition of sort of heteronormative patriarchal structures, can often precede broader campaigns of violence and persecutions against other groups. So violence against LGBTQI populations can be an early warning signs for atrocities. And there was this particular line in the paper which I really liked and resonated with me, that said that increased risks against one group does not lead to the protection of others, and that's so true. So I think that in that context, the paper sort of is innovative. It opens up the conversation, which has been there sort of in a very muted way, present within the atrocity prevention field, but has not been sort of recognized as a particular blind spot. And in the sort of the first few minutes that I have in terms of speaking, I just want to problematize it further. And in the context of sort of 3 points. So with R2P, the focus has been on populations. That is how we think about R2P, protection of populations, the responsibility of state and the international community in terms of populations. So we don't use words like citizens. We also don't use words like civilians. It is about mass atrocities. So in the context of populations and mass, the focus has been on sort of ethnic minorities. The focus has not necessarily been on gender. And the focus is absolutely has not been on sort of looking at minorities of different sorts of gender, of political minorities even. So that's sort of the first point. And that sort of is reflected in the early warning frameworks that were developed, especially in the earlier part of the development of R2P. Since 2005 to sort of the first 10 years of different frameworks that were developed around understanding early warning signs on R2P, around the institutional mechanisms that were developed, were very much gender blind to everything. As your paper outlines, that women are mentioned twice in the UN framework of analysis. I mean, we have raised this point again and again with powers that be, but there's not been much traction around it. So, and in the context of sort of, and then that's not also true of just R2P or atrocity prevention. I think that the paper also outlines, and I think that all of you have mentioned this separately, that even within the humanitarian sphere, I think that I was on a panel with Peter Maurer of ICRC, who actually said that how dignity kits are largely only provided to women and girls and not to boys and men. Even acknowledging that sexual violence affects boys and men is not sort of, very mainstream. So I think that within the international sphere, and I want to sort of specifically point to this, is that there is a conflation, and in the UN language, there's a conflation between gender and women. We use it interchangeably. We don't talk about gender in non-binary terms. We don't acknowledge gender even to relate to men. Actually, in many cases, gender is always talked about in the context of women and women's experience. So when we started, when we started including women in the context of R2P, in the context of understanding how to look at populations that are suffering from atrocity crimes, from early warning to response, the idea was, okay, let's start thinking about how atrocity crimes affect men, women, boys, and girls differently. There was not much conversation, and there is none yet, on how it affects, populations that identify differently, or how sexual orientation is a factor that could affect a certain population or a certain person differently, or their experience of atrocity crimes. So those are some of the big blind spots that exist. Also, I think the biggest blind spot which exists is that even now, I mean, there are many examples in the paper, we don't really acknowledge, or we don't really sort of focus on how LGBTQI communities are particularly vulnerable in certain societies. We don't acknowledge that. We look at atrocity crimes and we look at them in the context of how it is affecting the population as a whole, and not as in a disaggregated way. So I will stop there, but I just want to sort of, again, say that this is an important contribution. And, moving forward, when we want to talk about how we remedy this, and that will be part of sort of the second part of the discussion, we also have to think about how we are including LGBTQI communities in the conversations that we're having in the atrocity prevention field. I think some silos have been broken with the WPS agenda, but the WPS agenda has also sort of dominated the discussion on gender within the atrocity prevention field. And they have also sort of taken up space and been conservative enough to not even allow a discussion on how sexual violence affects boys and men. LGBTQI communities have still remained very, very peripheral in that discussion. So we have to think about all of these different silos that we have to break, and also to just end it, that we also have to break different silences that we are all complicit in terms of the crimes that are being committed against the LGBTQI communities. So just to summarize, I think that 3 big points is stop conflating gender with women, think about gender in non-binary terms, which is not happening within the international sphere. We explicitly think about gender. I mean, the Genocide Convention doesn't acknowledge gender as a category. Even the Rome Statute talks about gender in a binary way. So we have to think about that. We have to move beyond heteronormative understanding of how atrocity crimes affects different sections of population. So we are still thinking in terms of only women, girls, boys, and men. We are not thinking in terms of people who identify differently. The third part is that we have to pay particular attention to the crimes that affects LGBTQI communities in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Savita. I wish we were all together in a room and we could just really dig in. I loved that sentence that you said, though, about breaking silos, but also breaking silences. And I think that resonates a lot. And I'm actually just going to kind of throw the floor back to you, Savita, to kind of kick a little bit of a conversation going between the 3 of you, much as I would like to ask all of you many, many questions, but I shall save those for another day.
Thanks, Kate. So my question is to Jess. Jess, you talked a lot about how the paper outlines the different vulnerabilities that LGBTQI communities face, and sort of the gaps that exist right now in terms of what states are not doing, what society organizations are not doing, what researchers are not doing. So can you elaborate a little bit on what states can do at the UN level to demonstrate their own recognition that they acknowledge LGBTQI people, and acknowledge that they are part of who R2P serves.
Great, thank you so much, Savita, and for your comments. So very generous. Yeah, I think just touching on your comments. I think, yeah, the nuance in R2P, like it's been a slow and steady pattern, hasn't it, over time to sort of break down these barriers and to be more inclusive and more explicitly inclusive around gender and around race and children and yeah, pushing forward the conversation on queer identities as well. But I think that, yeah, that the nuance that's coming into the conversation is really exciting to see over time. But in terms of what states can do at the UN level, and I think something that we've all kind of touched on is just breaking down the heteronormativity and the assumption that communities are the same, that a population is a homogenous unit, that the assumption that people are heterosexual or cisgender. So it's breaking down those assumptions as kind of a first principle. I think using the language of inclusion is really important, and I think it's something that I've become ever more aware of in recent years that the explicit inclusion of queer people, whether that be through, people listing their pronouns, or whether it be through, rainbow flags or the inclusive pride flag, that it makes such a difference to welcoming queer people into spaces. So to come back to states, I think what we found is that states are often not using that language of inclusion and not being explicit about those commitments. And I think, referring to queer communities in their framing of R2P is something that's important, because that means the conversations will be happening. It goes beyond R2P, as we've kind of all touched on, that it's mainstreaming of thinking about gender and sexual diversity across a range of different areas. So that's across the women, peace and security agenda, in how humanitarian aid is delivered, and in the atrocity prevention sphere specifically. I think at the moment, I mean, in the US where you are, and in the UK where I am, we're seeing quite an intense politicization of gender and sexuality and reproduction as well. And I think we need to be stepping that back to a depoliticization of these identity categories that have always existed, that always exist in all communities. And just accepting that as just a normal, everyday part of life. Another thing that states can do specifically is to invite Victor as independent experts to make country visits and to do that assessment and analysis and provide recommendations for support. Something else that we've been thinking about in this project is we really want there to be more dialogue and advocacy and engagement between atrocity prevention actors and between LGBTQI plus rights actors. And a concrete example of that at the state level is that the UK is hosting a conference in June called Safe to Be Me, which is a LGBT conference, and states could send their R2P focal points to that conference as a clear and concrete way of sort of cross-pollinating those different areas. But really what we want to do here is continue the conversation, open up the conversation and keep that moving forward. So thank you so much for that question. And maybe I could ask Victor a question now. So Victor, I've been so delighted by the reports that you've been releasing in your role as independent expert. I think they've been incisive, and I think they've been eloquent, and really a delight to read. And I encourage our audience to read them as well. But the question that I wanted to ask you is what have you seen in terms of change in your time in this role, and where do you see progress coming from? What are you hoping to achieve in the role?
Thank you very much, Jess. And I'll use an old device, and meaning I'm going to start by not answering your question, but rather refer to something that Savita said. And that is, I find that this highlighting of the importance of recognizing gender in its more ample acception is the fundamental element for recognition of what are the root causes of violence against LGBT persons, because by recognizing that we all live experiences in interaction with preconceptions about what our quote-unquote roles should be in a society, we can extract a lot of conclusions about when we are being punished for challenging that imposed order. And recognizing as well, to me, it has led to the recognition that communities are not monolithic. There is not such a thing as LGBTIQ plus factors of risk. There are very specific factors of risk in relation to the way a person is living their life at the point of intersection of different factors. And this is why I know intersectionality has now become somewhat of a buzzword, but I would like to stress the importance of using it as a political, methodological imperative in our work, because we work in those points of contact. And now, Jess, to answer your question, as I should do, I think that the fundamental thing that was achieved by the creation of my mandate was that it signals a political acknowledgement that sexual orientation and gender identity are an indispensable part of the analysis of violence and discrimination. And that if that element is not there, we will never be doing a thorough job at understanding how to address violence and discrimination. And to me, that acknowledgement, which is essentially a political one, has been underscored by the evidence that the mandate and others, the High Commissioner for Human Rights and many others, have placed in front of the international community, where the fundamental pragmatic theory is we can have discussions as to a number of things, same-sex marriage, this and that and so forth. Yes, we can have disagreements as to those issues. I take the point of departure in international human rights law. I believe those are fundamental rights under it, but we can have that discussion. But what is not up for discussion is that violence and discrimination in its institutional way, criminalization, or in its practical way, the most heinous violations, is prohibited under international human rights law, and that you need to understand it if you're doing a serious exercise of diagnosis. And I think that that is reflected in the work of states, where I think the framing is very important. It is really not about a special set of rights. It's about understanding how sexual orientation and gender identity lie at the base of violations. And it's also about what legal tools we have to integrate to the language. And finally, what methodological tools we have. And on that, I think that significant traction is coming from the Office of the Secretary General, where there's initiatives to ensure that all members of the human rights family, this is highlighted in your report, by the way, not only adopt this as political, but also as part of their programming frameworks, how to integrate into the programming frameworks the queering of such programming frameworks. That is one set of consequences that I think are going on. Jess, you brilliantly described the issue of backlash, so I'm not going to go into it, just to say that we acknowledge that that is part of the context in which we are working. The solution to me is to provide evidence, something that this report does very well, to create an objective discussion that is not in itself based on prejudice or political capitalization. And finally, I just wanted to add, in a field that is not my own, but in which I observe a lot of interesting progress, is precisely the issue of international criminal law. And Savita, you were mentioning about this rather binary and, let's say, outdated understanding in the Rome Statute. But I think significant progress has been made by the International Law Commission on the draft convention on crimes against humanity, for example, where those conversations are there. A joint submission by a number of special rapporteurs and independent experts presented that recommendation. And finally, as we all know, the process of consultation of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, that actually led by Lisa Davis as the advisor of the prosecutor, is going undoubtedly to be having some of these discussions. My colleagues and I just presented a paper in relation to these issues to the prosecutor with a number of recommendations. And in a way, that leads me to my question that I would like to raise for you, Savita, because what we are talking about is queering spaces as a methodological and principle decision, something that we simply have as a principle decision, and then it becomes, in a way, a check mark how to do it in a way that is substantial and honest, also in methodological terms. And so for persons like me that are not coming from the peace and security world, so to speak, but that necessarily interact with it, what do you think, what role do you think peace and security, civil society, and perhaps particularly atrocity prevention NGOs can play in securing this process and interacting with all of these rich, textured, nuanced processes that we see developing around the whole UN family right now.
No, thank you for that question. I think that so much has been said, so it's always sort of, you know, not great to be the third speaker when you are, you know, following Jess and Victor. But to add to the paper and all the recommendations that I outlined in the paper, so I'm endorsing those recommendations and just adding to those recommendations. I think that, you know, as civil society organizations which work in a sort of peace and security space and / human rights space, I would say that first, I think that all of us need to look internally and break the heteronormative gaze. I think that's such an important thing to start with. I think that in our discussions, in our advocacy, we need to break that gaze that exists so profoundly within this space. And second, I think that also acknowledging what Victor said, that constantly sort of bringing this to the point that how sexual identity and gender is at the heart of so many different kinds of violations and so many different kinds of atrocity crimes that we witness. So again, I mean, all of these are sort of acknowledgements in the work that we are already doing. And in terms of sort of very, very practical solution, of very practical sort of ways to move forward, for civil society organizations like mine, which are part of different kind of networks, which run as which act as secretariat for different kinds of networks, I think that it's so important to sort of start breaking the silos in a way that we start including more LGBTQI organizations working at the international level, at the national level, and at the local level. And in the paper, there are many ways in which you talk about sort of how to break certain biases, especially that exist, when you go to the national and the local level. I mean, there's a lot being said about inclusion of national and local voices, but many times those voices are also very parochial. So how do we navigate those spaces? But so it's so important to start including those voices and not just speak on behalf of them, but to give them the voice. I think that the other sort of very obvious way that we have to think about this is, and which I also highlighted in my previous intervention, is that we also have to start looking beyond sort of the obvious situations, the Afghanistans, but across the board sort of adopt a LGBTQI lens or a gender lens, which is an expansive gender lens. When we do our early warning analysis, when we look at a particular situation as to whether there is a risk of atrocity crimes, and within that gaze sort of also include that what are the particular risks to LGBTQI communities, as you talk about in the paper with Ukraine, etc. I think that in the context of sort of the UN Joint Office, they do a lot of work within their programming, as Victor sort of pointed out, not only in terms of principles, but in your programming. There's a lot of programming which is happening on hate speech across the board, not only with the Joint Office, but many NGOs in the international sphere are doing that. So we have to sort of think about how hate speech, and particularly hate speech around gender and towards LGBTQI people exist, and how that could be seen as a precursor to certain kind of crimes being committed against these populations. Again, the final part is, in the sort of the mandates that we work for, whether it's Security Council or HRC, and which you highlighted in the beginning, especially in the context of sort of, commissions of inquiry or fact-finding missions, which establish the fact of a particular situation. I mean, there is more and more calls of including voices of women, experiences of women, but I think that we have to expand that to include LGBTQI experiences. I think it exists in certain investigative mechanisms and fact-finding missions and other forums which establish a fact of a particular situation, but it's still very ad hoc. I don't think that we use an expansive form of gender or sort of even bring in LGBTQI experience of atrocity crimes within these, be it Myanmar, be it Ethiopia, or be it any other investigative mechanisms that currently exist. And to stop, like the finalizing that the message which all three of us have been giving constantly is stop conflating gender with women. And that is sort of a very, very big problem within the peace and security sphere, where WPS sort of dominates all discussion on gender, and there's not really much space for it. So I think that is where we need to break the silence. And the final point is, again, gender training is not about, it's not only about training on women. And that is what is sort of the norm right now. So we have to think about and advocate for gender training that is more expansive. I'll stop there, but those are some of the sort of the broad recommendations. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And what a place to end with kind of that really thoughtful and practical set of recommendations that I think actually really build on those broader ones that we set out. And it I think gives all of us, especially those that work in practice, steps that we can take. And sometimes we are good at talking about problems and the things that we're not doing, but when there's steps that we can take, then it becomes tangible, and then it's on us to take them forward. And in that spirit, I'll end with just a couple of remarks about what we are doing next. And we are continuing to look at our own internal policies and how we work as an organization, not just on from the perspective of kind of the narrower understanding of queering work, but actually in looking at how we as an organization function, and how it's constant work to look at deconstructing kind of the power imbalances that exist in our organization. And we, especially in the executive team, also continue to get things wrong. And so we're looking at that work that we've always tried to do, but this work has brought new energy to how we will be going forward in the next sort of months and years. And I think it's important to start at our own table and admit that those gaps and learnings can always be learnt there. As Jess says, the UK government is going to be hosting the Safe to Be Me conference this summer, which is a real opportunity for the UK to lead, and we're really proud to have the funding from the UK government to support us in this work. It came from a particular fund that was looking to support LGBTQI inclusive or specific work on women, peace and security, conflict prevention, and so on. And that's so welcome. We want to see more of it, and fantastic. And I hope that atrocity prevention and what that means for queer communities can be part of the formal agenda of that conference. I think that would be a really important practical step that we in the UK could take forward. A number of you talked about indicators. A part of this project is actually, which my colleague Farida is leading on, is a series of community consultations on what a draft set of indicators might look like, because we found that the frameworks don't have them. So we're looking at what might be used to help plug that gap in a really practical way. But let's end with kind of that broader point around conversation, taking this energy forward, and Savita's point of not just breaking silos, but breaking silences, which I think our panel has done tremendously. I feel so energized and privileged that the three of you were able to come together and have this fantastic conversation. Victor, Savita, amid your incredibly busy, important schedules, to come with such energy, to have engaged with that report in such a thoughtful manner. It sets us up so well to go forward. To our audience, thank you for joining us around the world. And to our co-authors, thank you too for your work and your writing. And with that, miraculously on time, which I have never achieved before, I bid you thank you, enjoy the rest of your days wherever you are in the world, and let us keep talking about this important work. Goodbye.